Okay, so welcome to, and thanks for coming to Critical Design, Critical Futures 1. I'm Damian White, Head of History, Philosophy, Social Science at RISD, and this is...
Ian Gonsher, School of Engineering at Brown University.
And we're delighted to welcome you to this event. We've got a very exciting day ahead of us and a great array of speakers and panels. And I'd just like to set up our event today just by thinking about why we're doing this and why critical design, critical futures. So let me just give you a little backdrop and contextualisation. This discussion at RISD and between RISD and Brown really emerged and was triggered in the first instance by the Bangladesh garment workers' factory fire that occurred on November the 24th, 2012 in Dhaka at the Nazarene Fashion Factory, which, as many of you will know, left 117 workers dead and 200 injured. And it was the worst factory fire in a very long time, worst in the history of Bangladesh. But quite quickly after that, it was reported by the New York Times that Walmart had played a very significant role in blocking reforms to improve conditions in the factory prior to the event on account of cost. Subsequent to this, a year later, you will be well aware that there was a major building collapse in another industrial accident of garment workers where 1,100 garment workers died in a smaller town in Bangladesh, and it was the worst industrial accident in living memory. It was interesting and important for us as a community to address, not simply because of the obvious humanitarian questions, but because these institutions were intimately entangled in an economy of design, in a political economy of design, which our institution is intimately related to. This is the creative economy, or one particular side of this. So about 3 months later, we had a very productive and important series of events where Richard Locke from the Watson Institute came down to RISD, and we had an excellent discussion between apparel, textiles, history, philosophy, social science, industrial design, and faculty at Brown. And the discussion in the first instance was triggered by this humanitarian disaster and thinking about the nature of our design economy, our global design economy. But quite quickly it started to expand beyond that discussion, and it started to expand into the question of global climate change and expanding inequality. It started to expand into questions of our homegrown design economy and the extent to which that might actually involve a great deal of hidden levels of exploitation through internship culture, precarious employment, and so on. More generally, we were thinking about and discussing questions of the purposes of contemporary design and the extent to which, if we are honest, if things continue as they are we essentially involved for a large part of our time in a kind of landfill studies? Could it be the case that this is what we should rebrand conventional design in large part? And obviously it leads to certain fundamental questions which an institution concerned with design and its allied partner up the road should be asking itself persistently. Is this the kind of future that we are anticipating? If design is all about futuring, if design is about prefiguring, if design is about anticipating the unexpected, then is this the future we are heading towards? Are we planning on this? More generally, is this the kind of design that we want to bring into being? Is this the great genius of design thinking? Is this your professional legacy? Is this what you're going to spend your life ultimately doing? It's a good question to ask students. So where does this take us? Well, obviously, many of you will be aware that the history of design is vast and complicated and rich and plural, and there have been many moments in the history of design where dissenting moments, dissenting currents, dissenting visions of other futures have erupted and become possible, often sustained by different kinds of social movements which have come and gone. But the question then can be posed, where are we now, and how do we think about futuring? How do we think about design? How do we think about possible futures in the light of this? Now, many of my colleagues in the liberal arts were interested in these questions, particularly because it was our sense that many of the dilemmas and questions that design is grappling with are actually becoming coincident with discussions and debates that are going on elsewhere, and that there's a really interesting possibility for new lines of engagement and new horizons of thinking about design in different ways. So obviously the Richard Locke experience, Richard being particularly concerned with tracking commodity supply chains, global supply chains, posed us or pressed us to question, to raise the question, is it always optimal to think about design in object-centred ways, and object-centred materialism, or maybe are there virtues and advantages in situating material products in social, historical and ecological relationships and flows? And could it be the case that if we situate these things in historical, ecological relationships and flows, we can start to see that design is inherently political? That our designed world is a material world, it's a made world, and there are political choices involved in the constitution of that world. So that's an interesting kind of initial moment that many of us came to quite quickly, engaging with Richard Locke and the Watson Centre. But more generally, it was observed that if you actually look around the intellectual landscape more broadly, you can see that many other parts of the academy are coming to the notion that it is perhaps advantageous now to recognise the extent to which our worlds, our socio-material worlds, our socio-ecological worlds are systematically designed all the way up and all the way down. Now, this idea initially was very prominent in some kind of critically important thinkers in science and technology studies. Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, pioneering the tangled meshes of humans, animals, technologies and stuff that seemed to, they suggested in the 80s and 90s, be a definitive aspect of our modern experience. But these often radical, sometimes fringe thinkers, interestingly have been drawn together in much broader debates going on in the natural sciences now. So if we look at the natural sciences and we look at recent debates in ecology, climate science, earth system science, particularly around the Anthropocene, the very proposition now that we live in a world which has been comprehensively altered at every level by human agency is becoming widely recognised as a useful way to think about where we are. Here's the work of Early Ellis, the geographer ecologist, who maps the anthropocentric transformation of the biosphere and basically demonstrates through a whole set of gorgeous maps there's really not much left that can be seen in any way as untouched. If we look at the work of Will Stefan and the Stockholm Resilience Institute, similar arguments are being made, particularly in relation to the increase in the material throughput of all manner of socio-material processes, socio-ecological processes, particularly since the 1950s. This is referred to by the environmental historian John McNeill as the great acceleration, a vast acceleration in the material intensity of our transformation of natures. So, welcome to the Anthropocene is a theme that is emerging in the natural sciences. The anthros, human, seen, replicating the idea that we might have moved beyond the geological epoch of the Holocene towards one where humans have become a geological force on the planet, every bit as comparable to plate tectonics or other such forces. But it's interesting that if we look more broadly in the academy, we can see very similar arguments emerging. So if we take urban studies and geography now, we look at the work of Neil Brenner. Neil Brenner's arguing that we currently are situated now in a context of planetary urbanism. The city is expanded well beyond conventional urban forms, and in fact urban flows are progressively urbanizing the rest of the planet. Here's a map of Brazil and the Amazon, and Brenner is trying to track the ways in which the Amazon itself is becoming urbanized. Is becoming urbanized through the spread of infrastructure, through what were previously wildernesses, and the need, energy, resource demands of the urban hubs that it is feeding. At the same time, there's some really amazing work going on in historical ecology, historical anthropology, which is basically suggesting that planetary urbanism actually may have been going on for much, much longer than we previously thought. So a whole body of work has emerged over the last 15, 20 years, which has comprehensively transformed our understanding of the Americas, particularly the pre-Columbian Americas, in terms of population rates, in terms of levels of landscape and ecosystem transformations. It seems to be the case that indigenous peoples gardened, transformed, metabolized comprehensively with nature for millennia, well before Europeans turned up. And here's an example, again, going back to the Amazon. It's speculated now by Clark Erickson that about 12% of the non-flooded Amazon forest is of anthropogenic origin. So he's suggesting that large chunks of the Amazon were gardened by millennia, by indigenous people, often building fish weirs and other such earth structures to meet their needs. And there's some really fantastic stuff emerging about early urbanisation of the Amazon. Have a look at Charles Seaman, 1493, for a nice popularisation of that. So we're getting a sense, not just of a designed economy now, but a notion that across space and time, this has been going on for quite some time. So what does this bring into being in terms of thinking about design, thinking about politics, thinking about futures, thinking about the social sciences? Well, let me just finish with a few questions that hopefully might kind of percolate through these thoughts, but also percolate through today. Clearly, the question that needs to be asked in terms of our designed world, our design economy, the current practice of design is whose interests does this current designed world serve? Whose Anthropocene is being constructed? Yeah? Who's the anthros? And who's part of the conversation in constructing this vast designed biosphere now? Who and what is brought into view in this designed economy? Who has voice and who is silenced, or who continues to be silenced? A second set of questions that relate to the question of designers in this economy relate to the question of if we're living in a creative economy, a so-called creative economy, would it be useful not to simply see designers as users, but maybe designers as workers, and often embodied in very problematic working conditions and contexts? More generally, could it be the case that if design is about prefiguring, anticipating, and creating new possibilities, could it be that the old term workers could be designers? Could it be that in many realms of life now, working people could design their own lives, their own contexts, their own spheres to a much greater extent? And so we'll have a little panel about that later, thinking about something called worker-centred design. But there's other really interesting developments going on in the field, in fields more generally. So design futuring is returning quite extensively to design by many different directions. We have Susan Yelovich here today, who will speak later. She's done a wonderful book called Design as Future Making, and the shelves are getting heavy on the topic, but hers is certainly a premier collection, isn't that so? Yes. But at the same time, in the critical social sciences, after a long period of post-structuralist and postmodern malaise, where everything had to be kept open, suddenly people are suggesting that, prefigurative designs, prefigurative institutional alternatives need to be present for us to have a political debate. The old post-structuralist argument was, keep it all open and we'll have a political debate. And then we started to realise that if you have no institutional arguments to propose, then you don't have any debate. Similarly, in design more generally, there's been currents emerging thinking about design as a form of social activism, which runs through all manner of design social movement activities, from tactical urbanism to the continued importance of humanitarian social design, etc. So this creates in a terrain of potential engagement a range of questions that we can ask. Are there horizons for possibility now where design and the social sciences, design and liberal arts could have a much richer form of engagement? So, most obviously, we want to think about, what kind of design for what kind of future? There's an interesting question here more broadly. Are existing forms of design and are existing forms of the social sciences and the critical sciences, are they up to the job? Are they up to the job of the challenges that we have to meet? Are they up to the job of thinking seriously about the future? More generally, is design education as currently configured, is it up to the challenge? Is it up to the challenge of the vast job that we have to do? And how do we think about developing those relations in the future? Is it that we offer more a design education that's interdisciplinary, that's multidisciplinary, that's transdisciplinary? Or is it the case that design and the social sciences, design and the liberal arts, might have to become something quite different to address the full range of challenges that we have confronting us? So there are a few little thoughts about design and its futures. I'll leave it there. I'll just bring in my co-organiser, Ian Gonsher, who will say a few words. I think he's standing behind me, prowling behind me.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damian. Just to follow up on that great introduction by Damian, just a few quick remarks and then we'll get to the day's events. What role can and should designers play in envisioning and actualizing the world of tomorrow? This question, broadly speaking, will be our point of departure for today's conversations. We will ask, is design a valid means of cultural critique and social activism? Can critical design actually produce a critical future? We will also examine the limits of what critical design can and should do. We'll explore design not only as a means of facilitating the needs and wants of the user, that is usually the consumer, but also expanding this role to include the experience of workers and others who produce the manufactured objects that make up our material culture. We will finish the day with a discussion about how design theory and practice might reorient us towards new pedagogies in the art of teaching design. Today, we hope, is the beginning or continuation of a much longer conversation that will take us into the future. Not just the future of the world and its 7 billion plus inhabitants, but also develop opportunities for more collaboration between designers, artists, activists, and scholars at Brown, RISD, and beyond. The idea that design can produce a better experience for everyone is one that is worthy of our attention. Today's events could not have happened if not for the efforts of many people at both RISD and Brown. Damian and I would like to thank faculty and administrators at both schools who have supported this collaboration and these discussions from the beginning. Ann Tate, a big thanks to Ann for helping organize all this. Pradeep Sharma, Brian Goldberg, Richard Fishman, the Brown RISD Collaborative Grant, the 250 Fund, Rick Locke in the Watson Institute, Janine Conley in Academic Affairs, Brian Clark, Chris Swift, Kiersey Marcella Stroud, and Micah Barrett at RISD Media who helped us with the website. The RISD Brown Critical Design Research Initiative, and many, many others who have supported this ongoing conversation. We hope it's a conversation that we can continue with you as well. Please visit our website, cd-cf.org, for articles, galleries, and videos, including a rebroadcast of today's events. We will continue to post content to the website in the months ahead. And also, remember, stick around this weekend for other events, widening the conversation about design on College Hill. There are some great talks at the SEED conference, as well as the Architecture, Urbanism, and Humanities Symposium, including a keynote lecture tonight at 6:30 by Bernard Schumi. More information can be found on their website. The SEED website is seed.org, and SEED is with 3 E's, and the brown-risley-symposium.com. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Charlie Cannon, who will be moderating our first panel. Thank you.